Imagine you're in your favorite nature space. Maybe it's a riverside or a meadow, a forest, your local park, or your garden. You're so familiar with it. You're at home there. You know the nooks and crannies and everything that is there. And then imagine that you need to explain that space to me or to any other decision maker. You need to tell them what in this space deserves protecting, what even is there, what we should care about, what we want to protect or support, or just acknowledge the existence. And that's where it becomes tricky. Hi, my name is Emilia. I am a multi-species researcher and analyst, and my work is focused in how can we bring nature and its different aspects and different aspects of our world into decision making. So how can we understand nature and also make decisions that support nature and that support us humans reintegrating well into the environment around us so that we can combat climate change and biodiversity loss and pollution. And one of the key issues in my work that I find is trying to break down the complexity of the world, trying to explain to myself and to others how we can understand nature and what we can even consider bring into our work, our research, our decision making processes. And that's what today's episode is all about, because in essence, in multi-species work, one thing is simultaneously many different things. So, using the Joshua DiCallio's book on scale, I'll try to figure out how is it possible that one thing is simultaneously multiple things. This is a second episode in the On Scale series. If you haven't watched the previous one called We Can Either Work with Scale or Struggle with It, then please do so. It's available on the same platform where you are either listening or watching the episode today. Before we go, a couple of disclaimers. This is a generative AI free podcast, so I don't use generative AI in any way, shape, or form in writing the essays or then producing this podcast. It's also recorded in one take, so please excuse if there are any mistakes or mispronunciations. This is just what works best for me. And without further ado, then let's go and talk about today's essay called How is the Same Thing Many Different Things? We'll read the essay together and I'll add some commentary here and there, and we'll just see how well it goes forward. But how is the same thing many different things? Essay on Scale, Part 2. With basics of logical typing and illogical classifications that feed into multi-species work. And again, imagine you are standing in a field. There are flowers, bees and flies zooming by, some dandelions here and there, already fluffy, a creek nearby with the tiniest fish in it. You pick one dandelion to blow the fluff away, but before you manage, a strong gust of wind does it for you. You're just experiencing. You're just there. All is one. But what if you would need to describe the place and name as many beings and relevant natural entities as possible, let's say to anticipate the risks that prolonged drought would do to this place? What will you list? What will you prioritize or exclude? Will you list the dandelions, their seeds, the creek and the fish? Will you add the biomes? What about ecosystems and the processes that you know happen in those green leaves? Hint, it's photosynthesis and many other things. But will you add every single dandelion or just the different grass and plant species? Or say greenery or flora and fauna? You will list the humans that walk through the meadow daily, one by one? Or as a species or as human? Just writing that, I felt a bit overwhelmed as there are so many things to list, so many words that we can use to list what's in this multi-species environment, so many terms and concepts that essentially refer to the same thing. And this is what we'll focus on today. We will look at what we can learn from the scale theory book about navigating this complexity. The complexity where, depending on how we look or frame, the same thing is simultaneously an endless set of other things. Before we start, however, I want to ask if you have not read or listened to the first part. We can either struggle with scale or work with it on scale part 1, basics of scale theory that can help us navigate multi-species worlds. So if you have not read or listened to that, please do. This essay and podcast episode will make so much more sense if you do. I reread it as well before writing this essay and making this podcast episode, so the narrative continues to flow and also to build further without repeating or contradicting myself. Some reminders and disclaimers before we go forward. So if you have questions, you can ask them to me. I am a multi-species analyst and researcher with almost 10 years of experience in this field. So if you have some questions related to this podcast episode or to multi-species work in general, you can find the link to the form in the show notes and the description below. You might have also missed that Multispecies Digest is now on Instagram, and there have also been 2 Multispecies Digest podcast episodes, which I call the multi-species analysis. So one is on AI data centers and water, and the second one is on extreme European heat. Also, if you have not subscribed yet, please do. Please like this episode, subscribe, and then also consider leaving some comments or questions in the comment section. As of disclaimers, the essay in this podcast is human written and human produced. I do not use generative AI in my writing. I do not. Everything is planned, drafted, edited by me. So also you might see some spelling mistakes or some issues in there as well. But I hope that just adds some charm to it. Also, all views are my own and do not reflect those of my employers and affiliated organizations, and the essays and podcast episodes are not peer-reviewed. They do not constitute scientific theories or findings, and perspectives, my perspectives, can change as new information emerges. If you're new, then you should know that Multispecies Digest is based on a basic premise. If you've heard this before, you can just skip a couple minutes forward. There's also the timestamps down below, but the basic premise is that we're living in multi-species world. Humans, our creations, our lives and businesses are deeply entangled with the natural world, with all its creatures, processes, systems, and landscapes. We're directly and indirectly connected through flows of materials, electrical energy, heat, nutrients, as well as experiences, emotions, chemical and physical reactions, and even quantum fields. Humans and nature are inseparable. No matter how hard our education, religion, economy, and personal egos might try to tell us otherwise. And there is definitely big questions about this idea that humans and nature, like what is even human, what is nature? But we'll unpack that some other day. Right now, humans need to relearn how to live and do business in a way that sees the interconnections and acknowledges physical and other limitations and drastically reduces negative impact on nature. So if you want to learn more of the basics, check out earlier Multispecies Digest essays or watch an introductory lecture that I have also listed in the YouTube description and in the show notes. But without further ado, at the very start of this essay, I described a scene where you or I or any other person or group might need to list things, natural things, processes, beings, systems to be considered in a project framed around multi-species issues. I do not want you to just stop and just think about how it would be how incredible it is to experience a natural space, I wanted you to list things, because once we need to work with that space, consider it somehow for some specific reasons and problems start to arise. It's quite tricky, as I said before. I ask you to imagine listing natural things for a project because I strongly believe that multi-species thinking and approaches must be practical, pragmatic, and actionable for everyday people and also for professionals, be that designers, urban planners, engineers, business consultants, policymakers, or politicians. Like everyone and anyone, I think, should learn better. How do we navigate and talk about nature, and how can we think in multi-species ways? So multi-species approaches need to be actionable and practical, not just philosophical explorations of how humans become who they are in relation to non-human things and beings. There's a big discourse, multi-species discourse here, that or then kind of pleasant experiences without a goal, or ethical pursuits to find the best, the most moral way to treat working animals or rivers. And again, there is value in that, but I don't see it as very practical. I don't find it the most relevant for what I want to do. Nor am I interested in outlining the most non-anthropocentric way to live life. At my core, I am a problem solver, a thinker, yes, but a problem solver. I'm interested in complexity, understanding issues, and building solutions. So that would be products, services, policies, companies that actually align with the multi-species realities of this world. And I'm interested in solutions that support everyday people, animals, plants, ecosystems, beyond just sitting on a high horse discussing issues, hypothesizing, and trying to build multi-species morality that's diverse or divorced from everyday life. I want practical, pragmatic ways how we can bring nature into decision making, regardless of what that decision making is. So this challenge of complexity and making it manageable for myself and for others is critical for me, because it's a step towards making multi-species more applicable in everyday situations. So going beyond let's sit around and reconnect with nature to hear 6 ways we can bring multi-species into urban planning and policy negotiations. I want practical things. And I'm aware that others in the multi-species research space have other goals, and I want to learn from their ideas and see how and what they do. But for me, pragmatism is key, even if it's not the only, and I know it's not the only way to go, and it's potentially not the best way to go in the grand scheme of things. So back to why I'm spending a whole essay and a whole podcast episode dissecting what I learned about how human language links to scale domains, and human experience of the world. So there's 4 reasons. The first one is language and the typical non-scalar ways how humans talk about nature has shaped me as a thinker, me as a researcher, so it has shaped everything that I produce. And I find it really important to rethink and also take a look at myself in a mirror and be like, okay, Amelia, what are you doing? So I'll start with the most obvious. I am a human that was born as a blank slate and has learned all I know about the world from other humans. Yes, also from what I have seen and felt, but all my personal experiences of the world are filtered through and encoded in the understandings of people who were around me, like my parents, relatives, teachers, and other kids, and also of those who came before me, so our ancestors, researchers, authors of school books. When I am in a field with dandelions, bees, and a creek, my understanding of what is around me is shaped by words others have taught me or the names given to things I see, smell, hear, and touch. When I think of a field, I think in the words, terms, concepts, scientific descriptions, and emotional retellings of others. As a multi-species practitioner who sees value in scale and developing scale-informed multi-species approaches, I need to understand how my thinking is shaped by the plethora of words, concepts, and ideas that I use to describe the world around me. To be able to rethink multi-species approaches, I need to understand how language links to scale and what are our ways to talk about it and to conceptualize nature, where did it come from? Where did my understanding of nature come from? So the second reason is that these ways of thinking and talking about nature have also shaped all the people around you, or people that you and we might need to work with. So multi-species work, how I understand it, so finding and building solutions in the world rooted in the idea that humans and nature are interconnected and interdependent. That work rarely happens alone. So policy, design, planning, that's the space many of us, you and I, work in. And it doesn't happen alone. So of course you could do multi-species work alone on, for example, your privately owned land where you don't need to deal with other people. But if not that, you most likely will need to deal with people. I will need to deal with people. So those people, the people that we deal with in multi-species work, have their own perspectives. And a lot of your and my and their perspectives will overlap. So think the same language, elementary school books, basic facts. There's a lot of common ground of how we talk about nature, but much will differ. So for example, based on the level of education, think middle school biology or someone who has a PhD in it, those two people have a very different understanding of the natural world around them. But also personality, experiences of the outdoors, someone who has lived in the countryside versus someone who has grew up in Manhattan and never really been, for example, hiking, then those two people have very different perspective, understanding, and view of nature. But also religious beliefs. The religions have different perspectives on nature. And then also professions. So a financial analyst for a bank will think differently than a landscape architect. So a profession, and maybe we'll talk about that in some next episode, but profession, what you have learned is the best way, the correct way to do what you are doing, very much dictates how you relate to work, to nature, at least at your work. Maybe not as an individual person, but, and there's also research in environmental psychology, how your personal relationship with nature and understanding of nature and your professional relationship and understanding of nature are different things. At work, it's a very easy, and most people do think about nature differently. At work, and then at home, they might have their own personal things. But as we do multi-species work, we need to navigate different sets of perspectives about the world so that we can grasp problems well and also find good solutions. So knowing how people categorize and think about nature is necessary. The third one is that how we think and talk about nature shapes science and scientific insights that are critical for good multi-species work. I'm a strong believer that we need science. I love science-based approaches. It's not end-all be-all. There are limitations. There are things that science could do better and where we are misunderstanding things. But I think that multi-species practitioners, we cannot do our work in isolation. We can't do multi-species work only relying on our personal experience. Much input, be that from courses, experts, or books and encyclopedias, is needed to see how a thing that we see, for example, a tree or a dandelion, links to, depends on, interconnects with, and affects things around it. What does the tree consist of? How it functions? We need scientific insights. We need to contextualize, and what I'll talk about in a minute. But the more I read the scale theory book, the more I saw that all those insights need to be contextualized. Not all scientific insights are relevant in every case. Some describe certain beings while others focus on processes and system dynamics. And as DeCalio puts it, there is a difference between studying a bats, and an ecosystems in which bats exist. So a bat, if we only study an individual, we're really focusing on one single organism, that we'll get one set of insights. We'll learn about this particular bat. If we're talking about bats, so several bats, or even bats as a species, And there's many species of bats, so like this gradation can go even further. But if we talk about bats as a species, we don't care that much, or we do care about the individuals because they inform our analysis, but we're looking for very generalizable ideas of how bats as a species, what helps them, how do they live, how do they evolve, etc. And then if the third part is the ecosystem in which bats exist, is again a different set of insights where we talk about the system and what are certain aspects that are there, maybe how the bat fit into this ecosystem. But the bat is just one of the players in the system when we are looking at the system and getting systemic insights. So bats as a species and ecosystems with bats, you research and you get different insights. So we as multi-species practitioners, we need to understand what the research is about and how to contextualize it within our work. Because each of these can provide potentially relevant insights, but each type of study will provide different insights, some of which may or may not be relevant. So this breakdown of language I'm focusing on today is needed to prep us for contextualizing how to integrate context, human experience, first-hand observation, and scientific insights. And we'll get there in the coming essays. So today we're really prepping. It's kind of a stepping stone for further activity, but I think it's really necessary to reflect on how do we talk about and think about nature. And the fourth and final, the way how we think and talk about nature has shaped the natural stakeholder typologies I developed. So in my work, I have been really thinking about what are these stakeholders, so someone who is either impacted or should inform how we make decisions. I've been working on that and I have one typology and I really want to rethinking. Why? Because I think that the natural stakeholder typology I developed, it desperately needs rethinking. Because multi-species work and practitioners, and primarily me, myself, and I, it's a very me-driven exploration, we could really benefit from a comprehensive system how to navigate what is in a multi-species context beyond just that what is immediately visible. And we read I, so I mean, especially myself, I want to figure out that we need a system for analyzing all that one object is and can be, and also what is relevant, because there's so many things in nature. We've classified them in so many ways. So the question is, what is relevant and what is a good entry point to reach the goals of the project? And this also makes me think that I need to clarify how to frame multi-species projects, multi-species project goals, and then how that can be done in a scalar way. And that's probably going to be the next or another essay in this series. So I'm writing or reading out loud this essay as a way to structure what I have learned from the scale theory book and what I've learned on language and how we humans tend to think about things, context, and places. So let's start. How do we get to linguistic and conceptual complexity? And as you listen to this, please keep in mind that I am not a trained anthropologist or linguist. Everything that follows is based on my interpretations of the scale theory content and other contextual things and everything else that I have learned during my 10 years researching this. So I might have missed some things. I probably left some things out, and some things very likely went over my head. This is a very contextual, philosophical discussion. But for thousands of years, humans have developed language and ways of building, collecting, and documenting knowledge about the world we navigate. We have done so to survive, to feel safe, to get a chance at a better, healthier, more predictable, nourishing, satisfying life. So we as humanity have developed over thousands of years, and we needed to understand the world to be able to live here. So from ground up, from a blank slate, and also through different worldviews and many, many languages. So it's not just in English, and it's not just in this Western way of thinking about the world around us. In many ways, humans have learned about the world around them relatives, social behaviors, places, creatures, insects, food sources, weather patterns, potential dangers, even who am I? Who is human? What is this meat suit I'm in? What's mind? What's body? Like we have started everywhere from ground zero, and through generations, through human experiences over thousands of years, we have developed the knowledge that we have now. So our ancestors looked at the world around them, identified what they could see and experience, gave these things names, tried to identify patterns, told stories, and strived to preserve their knowledge and teach others and younger generations about their discoveries. With time, whole scientific fields developed to help us humans build systematic knowledge about the world so that we would not need to rely just on our individual or group experiences. Instead, we could build a more holistic, more generalizable knowledge, geography, biology, ecology, then sustainability science, but also social sciences, politics, philosophy. In so many ways, we have done so many things to build knowledge, and everything that we have done has focused on particular aspect of the world, because the world is so big and so complex, we can't comprehensively study everything at once. We need to pick a lane, we need to pick a small sample, small sliver of the world to build some reliable knowledge about it. None of it, in terms of language and scientific insights, was built on theory of scale proposed by Collier. And the book, and also I in the previous podcast, as we put it, scale is outside of human experience. A human cannot experience scale because we can only experience one scale domain. Our human body and perception can only experience one of the scale domains. But scale is something we can navigate with our minds to help us build a safer, more predictable and functional world. This means that a lot, if not all, of things our ancestors identified and the words and terms they called these things developed without a definitive and in some ways limiting or rigid framework of how humans should see the world. So we've started from scratch and we're exploring and building. There isn't a frame we're trying to fill. So many things were identified. Our ancestors and we focus on what was relevant, what gave a needed insight, what needed focus, needed an explanation, and not what would fit a scholar world or scholar framework of the world. This also means that right now we have an extensive amount of knowledge about and so many words to refer to things and processes in the world around us. So many that sometimes it can become unhelpful. If we're trying to find how to navigate this place as a multi-species setting and build policies and solutions that support not only humans, but also other species and aspects of nature, we have so many words, we have so many scientific frameworks and insights and findings and so many things to navigate that it is a bit unhelpful at times. Or maybe it is helpful, but we just need a good way to navigate it, and we need to know what to focus on and what to leave out. Things to keep in mind about a scholar way of thinking as we go forward. I think it's important to keep what I have 3 things in mind. So with scale, changing a distance and position between observant, so before you, and the object, for example, a tree, changes what can be observed. So distance changes how we see things. For example, where you are close to a tree, it's a tree, but when you're far away from it, the tree can become an indistinguishable green dot if it stands alone. Or then it becomes a forest if it stands to other trees. Within one scale domain and across scale domains, larger objects always dissolve into smaller ones, and smallers always integrate or aggregate into larger ones. So a large can always become smaller ones, and smaller ones can always become bigger ones. So bodies dissolve into cells, forests dissolve into trees and animals and mosses, but then cells aggregate they turn into a body, and then the things there are in a particular space, when we zoom out, it becomes a forest. And the third one that I already mentioned, humans live, experience, and act only in their home scale domain. So the bodily normal scale domain. Only this is accessible to us through direct experience. So our bodies, our senses are effectively calibrated to experience this scale domain, and where we coexist with animals, plants, insects, etc. So this is what we're used to experiencing. This is kind of trees, insects, animals, the things that we can see, smell, think, touch in our scale domain. That's part of our experiences, but a lot of the world is not part of our experience. But our mind, however, allows us to know and build some kind of understanding of the other scale domains. So we build technology to view scale, access scale, and then understand those scales as well. This means that one object always is many other objects, even though in our this bodily experience that we're having, it's so clear, like, oh, this is a table and that is a flower and this is my body and that is a tree over there. Nothing is just what it seems to us in this one scale domain. Everything turns into bigger things and can dissolve into smaller things. Well, into smaller things, it's a caveat that unless it's the smallest particle, where right now we think that's quantum particles, maybe there's something under that, but the smallest particles can dissolve and the whole universe, well, technically it could expand into or be part of a larger universe of things, but I digress. So a single object is simultaneously many other things. As humans, we are used to experiencing things in our scale domain. So I think that the scale domain of our experiences, so what we see, smell, taste, touch, hear, without technology and without scientific insights, is part of how we identify things. It's so common for us to be like, oh, I see this, I hear that, I feel this, da 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 da. So within this bodily normal scale domain, a person uses senses to identify things, and then they integrate those experiences with previous ones and with information they have learned about the world. They filter it through some kind of a relevance filter and then can name what they see. So what does it mean to identify something? In our bodily normal experience, the most common thing that we think about is like, oh, I see a vase, it's a vase. I see stairs, these are stairs. But what is distinguishable, aka what we identify, see, name, recognize, depends on the resolution. So remember from part 1 or for the previous episode, naked eye versus microscope versus telescope. So what resolution you use changes what you see in the world. What an individual identifies depends on the scale domain, on the resolution that they use, and also what they find relevant in that moment. We humans identify and distinguish things based on our perceptive apparatus, so our human bodies. And to perceive or distinguish something at another scale, we need some kind of technology, be that micro telescope or an airplane to fly over field, or like a space rocket to see the Earth as a planet. But even if our minds can think of those things, also when we are not right in front of our eyes. So I think all of us have so much experience seeing and viewing the world, or representations of this world and representations of other scales, that we have some kind of a mind's image about what it is. But additionally, we could change our distance to the object or place. So remember, walking away from a tree changes whether a tree is just a tree or a dot or a forest. Changing resolutions changes what can be discerned and what is distinguishable. Picking the resolution picks the amount of detail one can discern with observation. So this change can be differentiated from other things. It's like really hard to differentiate each individual trees when you fly above a forest. So if you fly above a forest, you can't see each and every single thing. But you can differentiate where a forest ends and a field of sea starts. So that's the differentiation. What makes sense as a unit in this from this particular perspective, in this resolution, at this scale. But if changing resolution changes how things appear to us, everything in this world can be redifferentiated. And that's, again, a key insight to remember. Everything can be redifferentiated. differentiated, can be seen in a different way, at a different scale, from a different vantage point, from a different perspective. So it's a redifferentiated is a fancy word to re-identify or see in a different way. There aren't suddenly two separate things. We have just shifted perspective, and now the original thing look like something else. Thus, as DiCalio puts it, all objects and differentiations are temporary. AKA, we could always at any moment look at things from another perspective, and what an object is or how we differentiate it depends on the scale of relevance. So depending on scale we operate, we would identify different objects, but also depending on scale, different objects would be relevant. If I am looking at for some reason, transportation system comes to mind as an example. So if I'm looking at a transportation system in the whole Helsinki regional area, in this system, maybe routes and buses or fleets of buses are relevant for me, but not every single bench in a bus is relevant. So based on our goals, it also depends what we talk about. It doesn't mean that those smaller things don't exist or that the larger things don't exist, but the resolution, the scale of our problem dictates then what objects are relevant to us. And then these two ideas makes me feel more at ease about trying to analyze context. So the idea that an object can always be re-identified, and then there's it depends what objects we see. It really depends on our perspective and the scale at which we're working about. So I think this initial calming effect comes from the realization that there might be endless ways to see a place and list natural things and processes there, and that what is relevant likely depends on the scale of the problem we are working on. And I might be wrong, but let's keep going. Next idea is what something isn't only about what it looks like, it's also how we think about it. So we started with the idea that we would stand in a field and be able to see, hear, taste, smell, and touch things. This would give you an input in your brain and what is in the space. But there's another element at play here, and that's about what our minds does to interpret the experience we are having through the things we have learned about the world. So it's not only about what we see, but our interpretation is based on what we know, what is our previous knowledge and experience. So, for example, what is this sensation of coldness and light pressure on my skin? It's the wind, because I've been told that when this feels like this, it's the wind. Or actually, I spent a good time or a moment trying to remember how wind feels on the skin and how to describe it without resorting, it feels like wind on my skin. So it's kind of this, I think my interpretation is that what we experience and what we think is happening are so interconnected. We've learned throughout our whole lives, like one of our main things we do as children is figure out, this is happening and this is what it means. So when we see green things on a tree, it's leaves, and fluff on the dandelion, it's seeds. So kind of our previous knowledge gives us the context for interpreting things. So we automatically interpret things we observe in the space or even in our mind's eye, because the setting with the dandelions I keep referring to is imaginary. I created it based on my memories of previous personal encounters and what I have seen and read, talked about. And the setting that you imagined is based on your previous experience, and it's different from mine. So our field with dandelions probably looks different. So kind of this interpretation, automatic interpretation of what we see in a space allows us not to just experience the space, but to understand it and interpret it according to our needs. The interpretation is fueled by language or multiple languages, memories we have picked throughout our life, and objects that are nearby. Our brains use forest to refer to an aggregate of trees. So even this aggregate terms like forest, lawn, field, ocean, river, they already imply that there are smaller elements there as well. We just don't focus on them. But it's still by default assumed that a forest includes trees and other smaller elements. And then our brain also fills in the gap with memories. You have been in a forest before, most likely. I hope that most of you have been in a forest. Or at least you have read about it, seen pictures, watched videos, meaning you know from memories that forest is full of other things. Additionally, if there are trees near you, these nearby objects remind you that trees as such exist. So based on language in which your brain is encoded, your knowledge base, your memories, and close by reminders, you interpret the image you perceive around you. What is then the formula of how humans identify things? I think the general formula here is that humans identify things around us based on what we perceive with our bodies or with help of apparatuses or imagine to perceive in our mind's eye. So first is perception, plus then second, what our minds find relevant for the task, and third, how we interpret what we perceive based on previous existing knowledge. I might be wrong with this, of course, but I'm okay with settling on this draft formula because it serves me to explore how humans think about things. And we get to some scale perspectives in a moment. So it seems that if we are working on a project, both by ourselves and with others, we can look at who and what people identify as a complex variable process. Each person would list and identify, focus on different things based on their primary bodily experience in the setting and or their memories of previous bodily experiences or representations of similar settings, and their interpretation of the task or discussion, and then their previous knowledge. So bodily experience, memories, interpretation of the task or the goal, and previous knowledge. These are 4 elements, and there's probably more, but these 4 I found very relevant. Previous knowledge is also the aspect that, in my opinion, is extensively shaped by people's understanding of scale. I think that people have a particular scale they are used to thinking in. So lay people, like as an everyday person, lay people likely struggle in scales that differ from their human-sized experience. Like if you are not trained or asked to or encouraged to think at other scales, just think in systems. I was shocked when I found out that maybe like 80% of people in the world don't have the ability to think in systems. And I was like, that's very interesting. Explains why I find so many things very confusing, because I'm like, how are you not able to think in a system or put this individual action in the larger context? But again, I digress. So lay people likely think in their everyday experiences, and then experts like researchers or policymakers likely are locked in their disciplinary scales. So ecologists think in ecological systems, bat specialists in normal scale, but from a bat's perspective. Mycologists, fungi researchers, work between the normal and the cellular scales. And then we as multi-species practitioners need to holistically understand the scales and how they relate to each other and how our participants relate to scale, so that we can support people in collaborating and discussing issues from different perspectives without an argument. And I think maybe that's one of the other reasons why I was writing this essay, because I'm like, if I have a table full of people or a large project with 10 different people and experts think in their own domains, policymakers only think of this large scale policy but not of the human experience, and human like everyday people, they're like, yeah, but my human's experience is this climate change. What is climate change? Never felt it. It's just life. I think I need to know as a multi-species practitioner how to navigate that space, how to explain to people why they think differently about something, and then help them really work together and understand that, yeah, they're talking about the same thing, but from different perspectives, so that we don't clash based on scale. So that's where I think also this stepping stone of understanding how people think and talk about nature, and how is it that one object is many objects at the same time. That's why I wrote this essay. But then let's move on to the scalar or non-scalar interpretations of objects. If you're watching this, I have included the outline of the scale I used in the previous essay and previous podcast episode, but we will not really talk about the scales. I just wanted to include it to kind of show, or as a reminder, that there is the bodily and normal scale, and right above it is the planetary and ecological, and then right below the normal scale is the cellular and unicellular. So that's the only thing that why the image is there. But so we have gotten to scale, and when we have the aspects of scale theory in our knowledge, we can interpret the world, processes, objects, and beings through it. And I think this is also why I'm writing this whole series on scale, is that when I was writing the essay, I was like, oh, I'm adding this idea into my knowledge of how I interpret the world around me. But I also need to now remind myself, and maybe a good reminder for you is that people don't have that knowledge. So we can't expect people to know what they do not know. So for me, it's a reminder like, okay, girl, then you need to figure out how to talk about this effectively and how to inform and educate your process participants so that we can effectively work on this. But in the visualization above, or how I just explained, they have bodily normal skin domain that people usually operated. Above it is the planetary ecological, below it is the cellular scale. So humans can experience only bodily normal scale domain and have first-hand experience that they can interpret. I also think that this domain is the most saturated with research insights. The adjacent domains, so the cellular, unicellular, they're smaller than body, and planetary ecological one, bigger than body, because they're the ones that shape human home domain the most. So if cells form us, aggregate behaviors of microbes impact us, and then we have developed extensive technology to impact the cellular space. But then human behavior and action, along with actions, interpretations, and processes of non-human life forms and living objects, also they form the planetary ecological scale. So whatever we do at the bodily normal scale, aggregate of that, the sum of that, the overarching things that happen, that's what shapes the planetary ecological scales. And then the planetary ecological scale sets conditions under the bodily scale operates. So if our climate changes because we have screwed it over with our decades of burning fossil fuels, now that the climate has changed, it will impact our lives. And now there's all these news articles like, oh, just climate has already changed. Just embrace Mediterranean lifestyle and weather in UK. And it's like, we have issues because nothing is built for a different climate. But I digress again. So let's go back to identification and interpretation of objects, though. In the bodily normal scale, humans interpret and identify objects based on the formula I proposed, meaning the immediate or imagined experience plus interpretation according to a goal and existing previous knowledge. I think, and I might be wrong, people can navigate their normal scale domain decently. But there is still a large complexity here because there's a large saturation of interpretations and words passed down. We can change perspectives endlessly, even in this one scale domain. And boy, have we done that, and do we still do it? Like, there's so many words just to describe what is here without even pulling up a microscope or a telescope or thinking in systems. Like, our scale domain is saturated with the words, ideas, and perspectives. Like, you add 10 centimeters and suddenly you're talking about a different thing. However, remaining in the bodily scale domains comes with a caveat that we risk having a non-scalar experience where we assume that objects we are able to perceive is in our scale always remain the same. The mental understanding the body is cells or body is part of a global ecosystem does not happen in these scales. So if we do not think about scale, we can easily forget that there is systems level, and we can easily forget that there is a level of cells there as well. But if we are aware or nudged to think that all objects can also be interpreted at other scales, we can start having a scalar experience. In scalar experience, we assume that by shifting resolution, so going from one scale domain to another, or by shifting the distance between me and the thing, the objects will shift. Some will even seemingly disappear. The scalar understanding allows us to expand our capacity for interpretation of objects, to move beyond what is immediately perceivable by human bodies, and to link that knowledge of humanity has built over thousands of years. And here I'm questioning whether everyone needs to be able to have a scalar experience. Not everyone will, I think, but I think it's important for multi-species practitioners to navigate it, to have the awareness of scale and to link the information. However, humans can directly act only in our own scale domain. So we do need to balance that with analysis of multi-species, multi-scalar world around us. So I don't know how to integrate this, but that's probably why I'm writing this whole series. Before we conclude today, because this essay and podcast episode is becoming so long again, we will look at a couple more things: logical typing and scalar contradictions. So, logical typing. Logical typing, key mechanism to grouping things and building knowledge. Logical typing, in essence, is a theory and approach that comes from mathematics and logics. It comes into play when we need to talk about categories of things. For example, going back to our field example, one dandelion is an object, but we can classify it as dandelions, so category that includes all dandelions. We can also classify it in flowers, category that includes all plants without wood-like body that produce flowers. In plants, category of living organisms that have a particular structure. In meadow, or in local ecosystem, and so on. So we have one object, but we can have many different categories that this object belongs to. Dandelion is, or so we see it as, part of many categories, many useful categories that help us effectively navigate and research the world around us. Logical typing as an approach is important when we start talking about sets of categories or sets of sets. So when we've dandelion, dandelions, flowers, plants, and then we start talking about like the further category. Even, for example, plants is aggregation of the different species of flowers. So there is already a complexity. This means that when we start talking not only about objects, but of sets, so not of dandelions, but of flowers or plants, we need to be aware when we are talking at a different level of categorization. So we need to be aware when we are talking about an individual versus a group, or individuals versus a place. And a place is a way of categorize. That's why I put it out. There are a couple reasons for that. First, when we talk about sets, so flowers or plants, we need to be aware that we could be talking about the same entity grouped in different ways, because the same dandelion is part of the group flowers and the group plants. If we are not aware of it, at least in the logics terms, we will have logical contradictions. In the book, DiCalio gives an example of a barber, where a barber in a city shaves all men who do not shave themselves. But then who shaves the barber? Like, if the barber shaves himself, then he is a man who shaves himself. But he is also a barber, so he's a barber who shaves a man who shaves himself. Like, logically, there starts to be a contradiction here, because the barber is not a man who shaves himself. I do not want to go into details, but the key idea is that when we state that a barber shaves all men who do not shave themselves, it's a logical contradiction, because a barber, an individual, and men who do not shave themselves, a group of people according to a characteristic, are two different logical levels. One is an individual, one is a set. And this set includes the individual we are talking about. So to avoid logical contradictions, we need to be aware of whether we are talking of individuals or groups of individuals, or then groups of groups. Second, being aware whether we are talking about individuals or sets is also important, because individuals have their own relationship. For example, dandelion has its own relationships, and groups have their own. So the field, or plants, or flora have their own sets of relationships. As the Scales Theory book says, each logical typing provides another way to describe a scope of relationships. This means that every time we group individuals together, regardless of which parameters we use for that, we create a new category that has its own relationship to others in this category, just on a different level than the initial individual. So it has a different set of relationships. Third, much of scientific inquiry is based on researching sets, on researching groupings. Why? Because science and much of human inquiry in general, we want to build generalizable knowledge. We don't necessarily need information about each particular dandelion or how it feels or what it does. Rather, we need to know about dandelions as a category. Even with humans, we don't necessarily need information about each individual human, but we want more generally to know who humans are, how they feed, how to keep them healthy, how do they organize in groups, etc. So often the categories is what is research, not the individual thing or being. So that's why we also need to be aware of when we talk about individual versus when we talk about categories. I think the idea of individual versus types categories is extremely important for multi-species work because it is the aspect that I think trips us a lot in debates about legal rights of nature, non-anthropocentrism, ethics, etc. Why? I see that now those become about debates in which, like, about categories we consider of important, or do we only consider as individual important? So like in non-anthropocentrism, so much talk is about which categories of living things deserve to have moral standing. And it's like, yeah, but we're talking about the same individuals, but we just group them in a different way. And now we are fighting in each other because, oh, this category, yes, and this category, no. It's very weird. And then debate, so I feel like the debates get lost in the sauce because they're just talking about different ways we humans have grouped beings and objects on this planet without maybe being aware that they're talking about the same individuals, only grouped in different ways. Scalar logical typing and contradictions. One thing important to keep in mind is that logical typing does not immediately imply scale. We do logical typing even without leaving our bodily normal scale domain. However, when we do add other scale domains, we need to be aware not only of different types we develop, we also need to be aware that once we have shifted scale, the initial object we're analyzing likely does not exist or does not make sense anymore in this resolution. Other things are important. So if we move to a cellular level, a dandelion is now a set of cells and cellular processes. It still exists as a dandelion on the bodily normal scale, but simultaneously at the cellular scale, it's cells. So you're looking at the same object or being from two different perspectives. When we shift the scale domains, we are definitely shifting to another logical type or many new logical types, as many coexist in one scale domain. Once we have shifted scale, other objects are discernible, aka you cannot see the human body or dandelion anymore, you see cells. So regardless, when we shift scale domains, regardless if the object disappears or not, scalar contradictions may arise when we relate an entity on one scale to one on another scale, since the scope under which they function and appear distinct is different. If we talk about the relationship of a body and a cell, we really need to be aware that we are not making certain contradictions. This means that when we move across scalar logical types or scale domains, contradictions emerge because you're talking about the same object from two perspectives. Again, kind of these contradictions, be it logical contradictions or scalar contradictions, they emerge when we think we're talking about different things, when in reality we're talking about one thing from different perspectives. And we need to keep that in mind. Ourselves and people around us will keep talking about the same thing using different perspectives and different terms. It's not going to disappear. It's encoded, like how we talked about how each person interprets the world around them. And there's so many elements and layers to that interpretation. we can't change everyone who walks into a multi-species process, but we as practitioners should be able to navigate, okay, I think they're talking about the same thing from different perspectives, so let's unpack that. So yeah, as practitioners, we can train our minds to spot when people are talking the same thing, just differently. And the last thing for today is identifying objects versus analyzing objects. One last thing before we close for today. What stands out to me after reading the book and writing this essay is also that identifying objects in your with your immediate perceptive apparatus and analyzing them through different scalar and non-scalar resolutions are two different processes. You might be doing them simultaneously, but I think they are different. Identification is about noticing what is identifiable. So what is visible, what's discernible, what can I imagine, what I can see, taste, smell, touch. So identification is about noticing what is identifiable in a particular scale with the tools like your naked eye microscope, telescope available to you. You are trying to spot what objects you even have. What even is here? And this act, like what is identifiable, is relevant. Then analyzing objects, on the other hand, is about outlining all or much of what a single object is or can be in one scale domain, so logical typing, or different scale domains. So think bodily versus cellular scale domain. You already know what the object is. You just want to see it from as many perspectives as possible. So to identify objects, what is even here, versus I have what is this object at all different scales. I know what the object is, but I'm just going to analyze it now from different perspectives. I think those are two different things, and it might become relevant in the next essays. With closing remarks, today got a bit philosophical, it seems, and looking at cognition processes, how we name and analyze things, just to hopefully soon arrive at a way how to see non-human stakeholder typologies differently. But I think it's so needed, this ability to navigate the language of people, our own language, our own way of dissecting and analyzing multi-species setting. I think that's what's a good multi-species practitioner should be able to do. Not all people see or are able to reflect upon how they think about the world. Hence, metacognition and ability to reflect on own thinking is not a skill that all people exercise well. And boy, does that blow my mind, but maybe it's again a talk about another category or for another day. But I think we as practitioners can reflect and navigate this linguistic and perceptual complexity. We can find better ways to have different experiences, research insights, categorizations coexist. We will always have, or 99.9% of the time, we'll have different people with different experiences, with different insights, with different categorization in their mind, with different perceptions at the same table. So as good practitioners, we need to find a way how to navigate that, because most times we'll be talking about one or several things from very different perspectives. So I think that's it for today. If you would like to really go back and read the essay yourself, please do. If any of this resonated, please like, comment, consider subscribing. And also, if you know anyone who would benefit from this essay or this podcast episode, please share it with them. Again, today was about a stepping stone. We will be building onto this knowledge and these ideas from today in the further essays and further podcast episodes. But I really needed, I think today, this approach, this way of really rethinking, okay, how do we think? How do we talk about things? Thanks for listening, and I hope to see you in another episode of Multispecies Digest podcast.